In October 1929, great date to understand, it's still referred to in the popular culture. It's assumed that you know that the great crash, the stock market crash, began in 1929, and it begins then a decade, actually longer than that, event known as the Great Depression. I hope you don't have to live through a Great Depression, but the chances are, in a capitalist economy, you will. We have all lived through the Great Recession, and it probably would have been called another Great Depression, but the title was already taken. So they call it the Great Recession of 2008, and so forth. Housing crisis, banking crisis, and so forth, that may or may not have dramatically impacted your parents and grandparents. It certainly impacted me, certainly impacted George Fox University, and so forth. So these economic crises occur not consistently, but more randomly, but they do occur. So it is helpful to understand the causes, solutions, so that when they do occur, we can mitigate the disaster. Fortunately for the American people, during the Great Recession, the man who was the head of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, was one of the great students of the Great Depression. So he had a scholar's understanding of that event and had already written books about it. What should have been done, what wasn't done, and so forth. And so the Great Recession was not as bad as it might have been had somebody less accomplished been in charge. Well, there's a couple things about the Great Depression and the American economy that every American ought to understand, but sadly, most don't. The American stock market reflects the value of American public, keyword public, corporations. And in October 1929, the stock market crashed, meaning the value of those public corporations began to go down in a way that was not normal. Today, the stock market is down a little bit. Today, actually. Okay, I just checked it before I came to work, into class. Normal thing, down 0.5%, 1%, no problem. Tomorrow will probably be up again. The coronavirus, by the way, is impacting the stock market over the last few days. But in October 1929, the market began a crash that was catastrophic. What that means is the price of the various stocks tumbled. In this case, in the crash of October into November, about a 3-week period, the stock market tumbled about 40%. 40%, 40, almost half its value in about 3 weeks. All right, so everybody needs to understand what a stock is. There are public stocks traded on the stock exchange and private stocks that are privately owned. They're not traded. Les Schwab is a major corporation that is privately owned. You cannot find Les Schwab, for example, on the stock exchange. It's not there. But a corporation may decide to take its stock public at some point. And the reason for doing this is that in order to buy that stock, then that corporation gets a massive cash infusion as the public then buys the stock, okay? So you take a stock like Ford, one of America's major corporations, and they have tens of millions of shares, all right? And so you could buy one share if you had a brokerage account at Fidelity or someplace like that. You could buy one share of Ford for, let's just imagine, $40. But keep in mind, there are millions and millions and millions of shares, okay? And so what happened here with Ford over this 3-week period is that it went down roughly 40%. So your $40 went down 40%, that's $16. It now is worth $24, okay? That doesn't sound so bad if you only owned one share, right? But very few people own one share. They own 100 shares or 1,000 shares or 10,000 shares. So let's imagine you owned 1,000 shares. $40 stock, that's $40,000. It's gone down 40%, $16,000. You got $24,000 left. Now that hurts, doesn't it? Sure it does. Now here's the kicker. Let's imagine that you borrowed the money to buy those shares. Yeah. So you only had about 10% of your own money, and you've lost 40%, so your money's gone, okay? Because that's the first money to be lost, is your money. And now you've got to pay back the bank, the mortgage lender, or the broker. Stock you don't have, money you don't have, it's gone. And by the way, we're just getting started. And nobody knows they're in the Great Depression. They just know that they're in a serious stock market decline that's lasted about 3 weeks. Okay? So, you now multiply this all across the country, and you can see that there is going to be a major impact on the banks that have loaned this money out. They're not going to get paid back. Okay? Not anytime soon. So, stock, public corporations, private corporations, crash, and so forth. Borrowing money to invest in the stock market, that's called investing on margin. It's not your money. All of this took place in the Great Recession 10 years ago on a massive scale, okay? And that's why it was so serious, because people were losing borrowed money. Well, I've given you a simple version of what happened as a result of the crash. But the stock market crash and the banking crisis that followed were not the only causes of the Great Depression. In fact, the stock market crash made things worse, but it didn't cause the Great Depression. But in the popular media, and even in many textbooks, you will read that the stock market crash started the Great Depression. Well, that's not exactly true. So it's more complicated than that. History always is. Life always is. In a capitalist economy, and again, we're going to come back to your generation. Your generation, a lot of people have a very negative view of capitalism. And while the majority of people of your generation still have a positive view of capitalism, socialism is on the rise in terms of its popularity. In a capitalist economy, though, business people are free. They own their own businesses. They're free to make the decisions as to how much to invest or prices to charge and wages to pay within certain limits. Right? In a socialist economy, the government largely makes those decisions, especially for the larger businesses. There's less freedom. Okay? In a capitalist economy now, there's a natural ebb and flow of supply and demand. The business owners are making these decisions on their own. No government involvement, or very little. And good times, good economic times, human beings being naturally optimistic, life is going to go well for me, any negatives can't happen to me, right? That's a natural human response. Human belief. For example, if you drive across Newburgh or on the freeways, you look over to the person next to you in the car that's going by you at 85 miles an hour, they know that the cops are not going to stop them. And they're texting. And they believe that because who they are, they're not going to, crack that car up because they're texting. Optimism. Okay? Not going to happen to me. Think about it. Now, some of us are pessimists, but that's only because we've studied too much history. I say that so you understand human nature. We're naturally optimistic. And so in the good times, we're going to hire more people. We're going to build more factories, add to our floor space, or whatever it is, because times are just going to be good, right? Inevitably, in this free capitalist economy, we get too optimistic and we build too much, and we make too much, and then the recession starts, and then what do? We have to cut back wages. We might have to close a wing of the factory or whatever, and wait for the recession to end. That's a natural ebb and flow, supply and demand of a capitalist economy, because freedom is at work. In a socialist economy, the goal would be to make it impossible to have recessions. But it would also make it virtually impossible to have really good economic growth too, wouldn't it? Sure it does. Think about this. There is no socialist economy in the entire world that is remotely close to the productivity and living standard of the United States. Not close. That's just a fact. You can't find it. Okay? Well, optimism then, over-optimism perhaps, leads to overproduction and then ultimately cutbacks. In addition, in the world at this time, and especially in the United States, farmers, as I've already explained in the 1920s lecture, farmers are not earning a fair living from their farms. They're working really hard, harder than most people, but that was the problem. The more they produced, what happened to the price? The more it went down, supply and demand. We can only eat so much corn, we can only eat so much wheat, right? Milk, beef, etc. And there are simply too many farmers who are good at what they're doing, and so because they have new technology as well, and more land opening up, we're producing too much. We're working too hard. Crop prices were too low because of overproduction. Now, what is your average farmer, your average independent-minded American farmer going to do when he can't make enough from the crops he's making? He's going to work harder. I just got to work harder, right? That's the problem, folks. How do you solve that on an individual basis? Problem is, you can't. Working harder is the problem. Well, what if I decide not to work harder, but my neighbor decides to double down, work even more hard? My decision to not produce as much as I could is now really going to bite me, you see? And so these farmers, because the prices of their goods are so high, are so low, they can't participate in the manufacturing and commercial economy. They don't have the money. So they can't buy the new washing machine. They cannot buy the new Model T. They can't even buy shoes for their families in some cases. Okay? All right, so they lack what? Purchasing power. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that all of you lack purchasing power. Right? I lack purchasing power. Although it's not the Great Depression. What's that guy, Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon? He does not lack purchasing power, okay? He's got enough. I wish he would share with some of us. All right, so farmers lack purchasing power. And 1/3 to 40% of the American people are farmers. So it's a serious part of the economy. But it goes beyond that. There's worldwide poverty of a similar nature. Obviously, farmers the rest of the world over are in the same boat, because it's a world economy. But also those nations that produce raw materials for the industrial economies. The rubber plantations in Indonesia, right? Just to give you one example. Those people aren't making enough money to buy the products that are coming out of the industrial economies. So, lack of a market, lack of purchasing power the world over. And so the whole world is going through, at the same time, this technological revolution that makes it possible to produce all these products, but wages and profits have not kept up. Okay? There you go. You're going to have a problem. What happens now is a downward spiraling effect. You own a business, sales are off a little bit, you lay off a couple workers. Those people don't buy very many products now, they're out of work. Plus, all the rest of your workforce is a little scared. So they're going to go home and they're going to say, honey, we're going to have to start saving more, okay, and spending less. Even if you still have a job, the psychology has changed, and so now those people, even still working, are not going to buy as much. They're going to be cautious. That's going to add to the downward spiraling effect of the economy. That, after a little while, is going to mean more people are going to get laid off. Precisely what you were hoping to avoid, because Americans and people the world over decided to be conservative in their spending, careful in their spending. And then those new laid off people are going to obviously not participate in the economy, and now you've got a wave coming of unemployment and less spending and less purchasing. The spiraling effect, think of a plane that is spiraling out of control, headed for a major crash. Okay? That's what that means. And so for years now, not just that 3 weeks of the great crash, but those people don't realize it, but this is going to go on for years. We know it because we look back on it, but they don't. One of the ways to stop the downward spiraling effect and start the economy back up again towards recovery is for the Federal Reserve Bank, Wilson's Federal Reserve from 1913, to step in now and lower interest rates so that businesses then, maybe the business hasn't been too badly affected by this economic decline, and they feel like if they could have some cheap money, lower interest rates, they could open up a new factory and build some more of something that is still in fairly good demand, because it's not absolutely even across the economy in terms of supply and demand and so forth. Okay? So lowering interest rates should encourage business owners then to expand. When you expand, you hire more people, and hopefully then you come out of this recession. Unfortunately, this knowledge of how to manipulate interest rates in this way to the effect of ending a recession, depression, was not widely understood at the time. Economists were a little bit behind. And then, of course, even this methodology has its limits. Okay. You can have a situation that is so severe that even lowering interest rates is not going to help much. See, the Federal Reserve bankers in the early 1930s were more concerned about all the money that they had allowed to be put into the economy through relatively low interest rates during a period of optimism, okay? There was a lot of money sloshing around out there that had largely been fed into the stock market, which is one of the reasons why the stock market had skyrocketed in the late 20s. You had a bubble. Okay, the valuation of those stocks was too high. Somebody's going to come along and pop the bubble. See, that's the crash. More economic language there. Right now, American economists are worried that our bond market is a bubble. See, there's too much money in bonds. Could be. So the Federal Reserve should have lowered interest rates at this point, but worried about all that money they'd thrown into the stock market, they raised interest rates instead. Raising interest rates has the exact opposite of lowering interest rates. It makes people more cautious. So if you raise interest rates right now when this Great Depression is starting, you may exacerbate, you see, the Great Depression. That's exactly what the Federal Reserve did. One final major factor, I should say, made the Depression worse than it might have been. Almost every nation raised tariffs on international trade. And I've already explained how tariffs work, and we're back again now to tariffs mattering. Tariffs matter today. Nations raised tariff rates in the United States to the highest they had ever been. So imported goods cost more in America because of the high tariffs than they ever had before. Why would you do that? Well, if those imported goods cost so much, Americans are going to buy whose goods? American goods, okay? That's one of the purposes of a tariff, is to protect the domestic industry. Nations all over the world did this. Britain wants to protect British industry, raise the tariffs on American products, on all products, okay? France, Germany, they all do the same thing. What this does is stifle international trade. Brings international trade to a virtual standstill as each nation tries to protect its own market. But those people in Congress, they represent individual districts, and they believe unless they raise tariffs, the factory in their district is going to close. See? So they have massive incentive to raise the tariffs. Herbert Hoover knew this was a mistake. He tried to get Congress to not do this, but he failed. This raising of tariffs in the middle of the Great Depression was catastrophic. It makes it worse. It was so eventually so well understood that this had been a mistake that in the post-war years, after World War II, which is coming on the heels of the Great Depression, it became standard economic understanding that tariffs were evil. And so in the United States, we'll enter into a period of, quote, free trade. That is, avoid tariffs at all costs. And so both parties in the post-war world, up until the election of 2016, both parties were free trade parties, Democrat and Republican. That works great if all of the nations are on board for free trade, okay? But that's not human nature, is it? No, everybody is selfish to some extent. And so some nations are more prone towards free trade than others. Other nations will flat take advantage of that free trade. They'll protect their own industry while taking advantage of the free trade nations. This is exactly what China has done over the last 30 years, okay? Which is why American jobs fled the country, see? Because our tariffs are not protecting our businesses or our workers anymore. And the wages paid in Vietnam or China or Thailand or there for a long time, Japan, those wages were a lot less than they were here in the United States. And then they could sell those products with no tariffs whatsoever back into the United States and make a ton of money. So much so that American businesses decided to send their factories overseas. You see? This is exactly the situation that Donald Trump ran against in 2016. We don't have to send those factories overseas. We can go back to tariffs, right? And both parties, Republican and Democrat, said to Donald Trump, you're crazy, you're going to bring on a war. See? There you are. Tariffs matter. But since Donald Trump became president, and this is not an advertising for Donald Trump, it's just stating the facts, manufacturing jobs in America have started to go up again. Okay. All right. Now, you can decide whether you think that was worth it or not, you see. But those are the facts. Main point here for students in a history class was that the lesson out of the Great Depression and the Second World War is that tariffs were bad. So bad that these high tariffs helped bring on the Second World War. Okay? Helped. So, experiencing the Depression. What's it like? One newspaperman wrote of his experience. I come home from the office every night filled with gloom. I see on the streets filthy, ragged, desperate-looking men such as I have never seen before. In his experience, this was a new America. America in an economic catastrophe. The unemployed of the city has experienced what became an all too common fate. First, as I've already explained, the workers' hours would be reduced. Maybe the whole factory off 4 hours a week, just to save a little bit of money, right? Well, that doesn't work. Second, then, some of the workers would have their days cut back, maybe not working 5 days anymore. You get to work 4 days or 3 days. And that's, again, if the factory is trying to treat everybody the same. But some factories would decide, some businesses would decide, well, we'll simply lay off 10% of the workforce, everybody else gets to work full time. There's just different ways of approaching this. But the point is, it never seems to bottom. The spiraling effect, right? And so some factories are going to end up closing altogether. Some are going to say, we're going to close for 2 weeks, open up again, and that never happens. Depression keeps getting worse. Some do manage to survive, okay? Don't think of every business going out of business. That's not what happened, okay? It's always a question of degree. Some managers are better than others. Some businesses are better than others. I'm always amazed, though, whenever I see a business where sometimes they're bragging about when they started. Started in 1937, right? When I see that, I know immediately somebody had some guts to start their business in 1937, and they're still there. Way to go. And so now the unemployed begin to search for a new job. If you're unemployed in early 1930, you don't know you're in the Great Depression. You know that it's a serious economic downturn, but nobody's talking about Great Depression yet. So you lost that job, and you know what? You hated that job anyway. I'm going to go get myself a better job. And some did, but most didn't. And you might be out of a job for a year, and then you got lucky. You found a job. Or you might never find a job. But then as the Great Depression lasted year after year after year, you lose your job in 1933, you're scared to death now. Because there is no end in sight of this thing. Now what are you going to do? Sir, I will work for anything. I will work fewer hours. I will work for less money. Just don't let me go. See? But there's no money there. And so now you see men shuffling along and going to the soup kitchens, trying to get a handout. And psychologically, this is devastating because in this world, men supplied the wants and needs of their families, period. And the idea of welfare, that was absolutely anathema. Today, you lose your job, you go right down to the welfare office, right? The unemployment office. There's no stigma attached to it, not in our culture anymore. See? That is not the way it was in the 1930s. Living conditions in the cities were hard, but they may have been worse on the farms. Life, particularly for sharecroppers, it's an important word. A sharecropper is somebody who does not own the farm. Sharecropper usually lives on the farm, but they share the crop. Okay? Crop comes up, and they get maybe a third of the money for the crop, their share of the crop, see? That's a sharecropper. And the heart-wrenching part of sharecroppers in the 1930s is that many of them at one time did own that farm. But through any number of American recessions or depressions, they gradually lost the farm, many of them in the Great Depression. And so they were allowed to stay on the farm as sharecroppers, but they still saw that farm as their farm, you see. There's a gut-wrenching scene in The Grapes of Wrath where a sharecropper is kneeling in the dust. And the dust is, he's got handfuls of earth just sifting through his fingers. It was his farm, but not anymore. And he's literally bleeding into it, this ground. There was an expression in Arkansas that whole families labored in the fields from can until can't. From the moment you got up until you were too tired to work anymore. Indeed, even farmers who owned their own land were growing desperate. By the early 1930s, foreclosures were common. Again, they're not making enough from their crops to pay their loans. Eventually, the bank is going to go to the judge. The judge is going to pronounce foreclosure, and the sheriff is going to come out to the farm at some point and auction that farm off. In April of 1932, now we're well into the Great Depression, on a single day, one day, 1/4 of the entire farmland of the state of Mississippi went on the auction block. As the Depression deepened and more people were laid off, they naturally turned to their savings accounts if they had any savings. They turned to their savings accounts in banks to help them provide food and shelter for families. This decision on the part of so many people caused what is known as a run on the bank. Essential understanding of how banks work. Banks do not keep all the money that we have deposited in them in the bank. okay? There is money in the big vault, but not all the money we put in there. What do banks do with the vast majority of the money that we give them in savings and checking and so forth? That's right. The way they make money is by providing that capitalism, to people who want to borrow it to build a business or a house or whatever. They charge those people interest, you see. The lower the interest rate, the more likely we are to do that. The higher the interest rate, the less likely we are. So all that money's not there. But if all the people who have put money in a bank run to the bank to get their money out, what's going to happen? Bankrupt. That's where the word comes from. That bank goes out of business. Yeah, they're legally obligated to hand out money until there's no money left in the bank. Now, the Federal Reserve was created as an insurance system behind this, okay? And that will work as long as there aren't too many of these bank runs. Maybe they're isolated in a single part of the country. But then even the Federal Reserve can get overwhelmed. And that's what happens. How come there are not bank runs today? No, good guess though. But that would actually exacerbate the problem, wouldn't it? You can get the money out digitally, poof, gone. What's that? That's a good idea. That'd be one way to solve the problem. You can only have $100 a day. No, that's not it though. Yeah. Okay, Federal Reserve is bigger. It has more resources. That's good. Okay. There you go. Insurance. Your deposit today is insured. During the Great Recession, banks did actually go out of business, okay? But the Federal Reserve, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, provides a certain level of insurance, so you can't lose your money, okay? Why did that happen? Because of the Great Depression. Okay? The American people responded, the government responded saying, hey, we can't let this happen again. What do? We provide insurance. I'll tell you more about that when we get to the New Deal. But right now you need to know that when a bank run happens, some people will get their money out of there, but the rest of the people in that bank are going to lose their money. It's gone. And there's no recourse. It's just gone. Your life savings, gone. Now what are you going to do? Depression gets worse. Then the bank goes bankrupt. There's a great scene of a bank run in many people's favorite Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And it's good to tune into the bank run and It's a Wonderful Life just to see what that looks like. Now all across the country, Americans sought to get their money out of the banks. This was especially bad in the winter of 1932, 1933. The banking crisis snowballs, sorry about that, in 32, 33. Just after Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, but before he actually took office in 1933. Okay. That's the worst point of the bank collapse. And that's why Franklin Roosevelt's first job as president is to fix the banking problem. While Hoover was president, thousands of banks went bankrupt. Imagine the crushed dreams and the desperation that would cause. Your life savings gone. Hoover's response. President Hoover tried to pull the country out of the Great Depression. Yes, he did. Indeed, Hoover did more than any previous American president had ever done in the midst of a financial or economic crisis. He didn't just sit on his hands. He didn't just do nothing the way most presidents had done before. Most of the time before, the presidents and, frankly, the national government did little. They just waited for it to fix itself. Hoover doesn't do that. But what he did do was ultimately not enough. This is the Great Depression. His political philosophy of limited government action prevented him from doing enough to stop the Great Depression. Again, his political philosophy of limited government action prevented him from doing more than he did. But what he did do was important, and what he did do, the next president would build on. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, and the purpose of the RFC was to provide low-interest government loans to businesses who were in trouble. RFC, government help for businesses, okay? And that helps some businesses survive until Roosevelt becomes president, and then Roosevelt puts more money into the RFC. Very helpful. Hoover also understood that the Depression was very much a psychological thing. If people don't believe times can get better, they're not going to invest in new businesses or new factories or hire more people. It's not getting any better. We're not doing anything. We're just hoping to survive. Psychological. You have to believe, right? Few people did. So Hoover now encourages business people, and this is from almost the beginning of the Great Depression, he encouraged business people to not lay off their workers. From the President of the United States to Ford Motor Company and GM and U.S. Steel, and don't lay off your workers. This might work if what? If everybody does it, that'll help. People start buying stuff, that'll help. Okay? This might work if the Depression only lasts a few months. Okay? A few months. Like a lot of our recessions do. Only last a very short time. 3 months, 6 months. Okay? But that is not the economic collapse that we are in. So a lot of these business people tried to do what Hoover said. They put off laying off people as long as they could. But ultimately, it doesn't bottom. The spiraling effect does not reverse itself. And then you just throw up your hands and say, we got to lay people off. We don't have the money to pay them anymore. You see? So Hoover had the right idea, and people actually tried to do what he said, but it was just too serious, the collapse. What Hoover would not do, and what the next president would do, was provide income to the unemployed at the federal level. He would give government jobs on government projects to individual Americans. Hoover would not do that. There would be massive government spending, deficit spending on, that's using borrowed money to launch government projects and put Americans to work. This is the New Deal. Hoover said, no, if we do that, that is what? Socialism, or really close to it, okay? This is a capitalistic country, and if we start giving out government paychecks and government jobs to people, they will lose their self-reliance, their individualism, and eventually they will come to believe that the government owes them a check. See? That's Herbert Hoover. He won't do that. But Franklin Roosevelt will. If businessmen and the American people would not risk what money they had to get the United States out of the Great Depression, and they won't, it's clear 4 years in, businesses are not going to do this. There's only one entity left that can put enough money into the economy to reverse the spiraling effect. And that's the federal government. The states have already done what they could do. You see, the states can't print money. The federal government can. The states are already tapped out. And of course, the federal government would not do this because Hoover was president. And the American people are angry now in the fall of 1932, and they're going to elect a different man with different policies. Summary. So the Depression was caused by overproduction and underconsumption of goods, both agricultural and industrial. This phenomenon is part of any capitalist economy, okay? But the imbalance in production and consumption in this particular depression was unusually severe because of the new technologically advanced factories and machines that made producing goods even more dramatically possible. And then you combine the fact that farm profits and wages for those factory workers, although those wages went up in the 1920s, they didn't go up enough, you see. There's no federal minimum wage in the 1920s. Why didn't they just raise the minimum wage? Good question. Don't have one. Okay? When do we get a minimum wage? Another good question. Come back in a couple weeks. So this is called a lack of purchasing power. Wages aren't high enough, profits aren't good enough, especially for farmers and so forth. In addition, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates at exactly the moment they should have lowered interest rates. Finally, though Hoover did more than any previous president had ever done to address economic problems, his philosophy of limited government kept him from doing the kind of programs that would have helped individual Americans. I have a saying, philosophy is impervious to the facts. Philosophy is impervious to the facts. You can apply this saying to all kinds of different things. You can apply it to the people on the left. You can also apply it to the people on the right. Okay? You can apply it to the people who think that John Elway was the greatest quarterback of all time. Philosophy is impervious to the facts. Right? It's part of the human condition. We have our beliefs, whether they're economic or political or whatever, and for the vast majority of human beings, their philosophy is impervious to the facts. Now, that's a little bit of my own cynicism there. Any questions regarding the lecture? Yes? Oh yeah, I don't think I talked about taxes. So Hoover actually reduced taxes. Why would he do that? He asked Congress, it's a Republican Congress, Republican president, they lowered taxes. Why? Yeah, give people a break, and that puts more money in the hands of the average American. Lack of purchasing power. You drop taxes. Now, government's got a problem because it doesn't have as much money, but the American people immediately get more money in their hands. Okay? Again, just to tell you the facts, one of the things that President Trump did when he became president was give a tax cut to Americans because he wanted to get the economy going along at a higher clip. Okay? And it worked. Right? You can argue whether or not that was the thing that should have been done with that money. I get that, okay? But that's what he did, why he did it, and it worked, okay?
And then there's international trade.
Yeah, so international trade has to do with the tariff. Okay, so international trade goes in the toilet because the tariffs are raised all over the world, okay? And that hurts, obviously, everybody's economy. Okay? Anybody else? Yes, over here. When he was elected? Yeah, okay, so when he was elected, people thought that they had elected the man who had the answer for everything. Herbert Hoover was one of the most popular presidents in the first 6 months of his administration we've ever had. You may be surprised to learn that Herbert Hoover had a reputation as a major humanitarian. Herbert Hoover was the American who led the effort in the middle of World War I to feed the people of Belgium and other people starving in Europe. And so he is actually then providing aid across a war zone. Okay, Herbert Hoover. During the great Mississippi River flood of 1927, when he was Secretary of Commerce, the people of the Mississippi Valley are just absolutely devastated by this great flood. It's Herbert Hoover who manages to bring aid to these suffering Americans, okay? He is one of the great humanitarians in American history. The irony then is that he is blamed for the Great Depression and the idea that he didn't care about the American people. Not true. Not true at all, okay? So, when he was elected, very popular. Of course, by the time he leaves office, he's hated and reviled. Great question. Anybody else? All right, see you next time.